Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a pretty weighty document, but a really important one.
Absolutely. We're looking at the European Data Protection Board's annual report for 2024.
Right. And forget wading through dense legal stuff. We're here to give you the expert briefing, the key takeaways on what's happening with data protection in Europe, what really matters from the GDPR world this past year.
Exactly. And it's more than just looking back, isn't it? This report, it kind of gives us a roadmap. It shows the EDPB's priorities, where enforcement might be heading, what guidance is coming down the pipeline.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today, boil down the big developments from the EDPB in 2024. Make it understandable, make it relevant for you.
Sounds good.
But first, a quick thank you is definitely in order for our sponsors. Their support is what makes this deep dive possible. First up, gdprizo.com. If you're navigating GDPR compliance, they're a great resource.
Definitely helpful.
We also really appreciate the support from cmmcnis.tools, providing essential tools and resources around cybersecurity and the NIST framework.
Yeah, crucial stuff in today's world.
And a big thank you as well to baseline.compliancehub.wiki. Think of it as your go-to place, a comprehensive knowledge base for all things compliance.
Great resources all around.
So where do we start with the report? The new strategy seems like the logical place.
I think so. They launched their strategy for 2024 through 2027. And like you said, it's not just tweaking things. It feels like a significant look ahead at their long-term focus.
Okay, a roadmap then. What are the main pillars or themes of this strategy?
There are basically four key areas they're concentrating on. First is really pushing for harmonization, getting everyone on the same page with GDPR across the EU, and promoting compliance.
Makes sense. Consistency is key. What's next?
Second, they want to build a stronger common enforcement culture among all the different national data protection authorities, the DPAs, making sure enforcement feels similar whether you're in Spain or Sweden.
Right, avoiding a postcode lottery for enforcement.
Exactly. The third pillar is tackling new tech challenges. AI, algorithms, all the things raising new privacy questions.
That's a huge one. And the last pillar.
And finally, number 4 is boosting the EDPB's own role internationally, making sure Europe's voice on data protection is heard loud and clear on the global stage.
Okay, that paints a pretty clear picture of their ambitions. How are they starting to, put this into action? Is there a specific plan?
Yes, the first step is their 2024-2025 work program. This lays out the concrete actions.
Like what sort of actions?
Well, things like providing really clear guidance, not just for businesses, but for everyone, including people who might be more vulnerable, supporting companies with compliance efforts, making GDPR enforcement cooperation smoother between the DPAs.
Okay.
And also staking out common positions where data protection bumps up against other rules, like competition law, for instance.
Got it. So that's the strategy overview. Now let's zoom in a bit. The report highlights some key opinions the EDPB adopted last year. These seem to tackle some really hot topics.
Oh, definitely. Let's start with opinion 082024. This one tackled the whole consent or pay model.
Ah, yes. The pay up or let us track your dilemma. What's the EDPB's take?
Well, their core message is a pretty strong pushback, especially against large online platforms using this. They're essentially saying, look, forcing users into a choice between paying a fee or agreeing to behavioral advertising. That often doesn't meet the standard for valid consent under GDPR.
So it's potentially coercive.
That's the implication. They stress the need for a genuine, free alternative that doesn't involve that kind of behavioral advertising track. You should have a real choice.
It feels like they're really drawing a line in the sand there.
I think so. And interestingly, they worked with competition and consumer protection regulators on this one, which shows it's seen as a wider issue than just data protection.
Good point. What other opinions stood out?
Opinion 11-2024 is interesting. It's about facial recognition tech at airports.
Oh yeah, that's always a bit controversial.
It is. And what's key here is their focus on how the biometric data is stored. The EDPB basically said the only solutions with enough safeguards are where the individual you keeps control over your data or the encryption key.
So decentralized storage, essentially, where I hold the key, not some central database.
Exactly. They stated that centralized databases, where the airport or someone else holds the unencrypted data or the keys without your direct control, are pretty much incompatible with data protection by design and default. Privacy needs to be built in, not bolted on.
That puts the emphasis firmly back on individual control. Big implications for how those systems are rolled out.
Huge. Then there's opinion 2-2024. This one gets into the nitty-gritty of controller-processor relationships. something almost every organization deals with.
Right, using third-party services to handle data. What's the clarification here?
The main point is that controllers can't just outsource and forget. They clarify that controllers need to keep track of all their processors and any sub-processors they use. You need readily available information.
So, more due diligence required.
Yes, though the extent of verification might depend on the processing risks. But ultimately, the controller is still on the hook for ensuring proper safeguards. The opinion also touches on documentation for international data transfers and the wording of those crucial controller-processor contracts.
The message is clear. Responsibility stays with the controller. And I see AI is on the list too, Opinion 2A-2024.
Yes, a very timely one. This tackles using personal data for developing and deploying AI models. A key part is their discussion around using legitimate interest as the legal basis.
Which is often cited for AI development, right?
It is. They laid out a 3-step test for assessing if it's lawful in a given context. They give examples like fraud detection or cybersecurity where it might apply.
Here, there's a catch.
Big one. They strongly emphasize that if personal data was processed unlawfully during the AI's development phase, that illegality can carry over and taint the lawfulness of deploying the AI model later on, unless that data used for training is properly and truly anonymized. So the ethical and legal groundwork of the AI is critical right from the start. You can't build lawful AI on unlawful data foundations.
That's a really crucial point for anyone working in AI.
Okay,
so those were specific opinions. Did the EDPB also issue more general guidance documents in 2024?
They did. 4 key sets of guidelines were finalized. First, Guidelines 012023, which dealt with cross-border data transfers by law enforcement authorities under the Law Enforcement Directive, or LED, focused on appropriate safeguards.
Okay, specific to law enforcement.
Yes. Then Guidelines 022023 tackled the technical scope of the e-Privacy Directive Article 5.3 to be precise.
The cookie law.
Often called that, yeah.
Okay.
These guidelines clarified that it applies to a lot more than just traditional cookies. Think modern tracking like URL and pixel tracking, local processing on your device, even IP-only tracking, IoT data reporting, unique identifiers.
So bringing the rules up to speed with current tech.
Exactly. It shows they're trying to make sure regulations don't fall behind the technology.
Good. What else?
Then we got Guidelines 012024, giving a really detailed look at Article 61F of GDPR legitimate interest.
We touched on that with the AI opinion. What do the guidelines say?
They really break down that 3-part cumulative test. First, you have to clearly identify a legitimate interest. Second, you need to show the processing is necessary for that interest. And third, the crucial balancing act weighing your interest against the individual's rights and freedoms.
And does it give practical examples?
Yes, it includes specific sections on applying legitimate interest for things like fraud prevention and direct marketing, which are common use cases.
That sounds very helpful for organizations. And the 4th guideline?
The last one was Guidelines 022024, focusing on Article 48 of GDPR. This clarifies the rules when courts or authorities outside the EU or EEA request access to personal data held within Europe.
The tricky issue of third country access requests.
Exactly. It emphasizes you need to assess these case by case and explains how Article 48 interacts with the GDPR's main rules on international transfers, like using international agreements or specific derogations. Very relevant in today's globalized world.
Definitely complex territory. The report also mentions EDPB statements on new laws being developed, right? They're weighing in on upcoming legislation.
They are, quite actively. They issued statements on several major proposals. For instance, the draft EU regulation on preventing and combating child sexual abuse online, CSAM.
A very sensitive area.
Extremely. They also commented on the Financial Data Access Package FIDA and the Payments Package, plus their own role within the new AI Act framework, the draft rules for GDPR enforcement procedures across borders, and recommendations about law enforcement access to data.
So, quite a range of topics. What's the common thread in their input?
Across the board, the EDPB's focus seems to be consistently on upholding fundamental rights, particularly data protection and privacy, and ensuring these principles are properly embedded within these new laws from the very beginning. They're acting as a guardian of those rights in the legislative process.
It's good to see them being proactive there. Okay, let's shift gears to enforcement. How is cooperation between the national DPAs working out, and what kind of cases are we seeing?
Well, 2024 saw a lot of cross-border cooperation. Many cases were handled using the one-stop shop mechanism, where one lead DPA takes charge for companies active across the EU.
Does that seem to be working smoothly?
Interestingly, the report notes that while cooperation was high, no binding decisions under Article 65 were needed last year.
Article 65 being the dispute resolution mechanism when DPAs can't agree.
Precisely. The fact that it wasn't triggered suggests that perhaps the DPAs are finding more consensus amongst themselves when resolving these complex cross-border cases, which could be seen as a positive sign for harmonization.
That is interesting. Less formal disputes, maybe more agreement behind the scenes.
Could be. And the EDPB also published a useful thematic case digest specifically on the right of access Article 15, which gives you insights into how DPAs are enforcing that particular right.
Okay. And what about specific fines and actions at the national level? The report usually lists examples. Any common themes?
Oh yes, lots of examples showing the GDPR is definitely being enforced across the board. We saw, for example, quite a few cases related to unlawful video surveillance. Fines in Austria, Belgium, Germany. It's a persistent issue.
Still catching companies out then?
Seems so. Another recurring theme is cookie banners. Belgium and Cyprus, among others, took action against misleading or non-compliant banners, reinforcing that consent needs to be genuine and freely given. No dark patterns allowed.
Right. The cookie consent fatigue is real, but the rules still matter. What other types of violations were common?
Data security remains a big one. We saw fines for inadequate technical and organizational measures, basically, failing to protect data properly in places like the Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, Norway. Breaches happen, but you need to show you took reasonable steps.
Makes sense. Security is fundamental.
Absolutely. There were also cases involving processing sensitive data unlawfully. Cyprus audited adult content sites, for instance, and issues around transparency and fulfilling data subject rights kept cropping up. Finland fined a retailer for unclear data retention periods. Lithuania acted on a right of access issue at a dental clinic.
Wow, so it really covers a huge range, from big tech issues down to local clinics.
It does. The variety really highlights that the GDPR applies broadly, and DPAs are active across many different sectors and tackling all sorts of infringements, big and small.
It certainly shows the regulation has teeth.
It does. And alongside enforcement, the EDPB also puts effort into engaging with stakeholders, the people and organizations actually affected by these rules.
How do they do that?
Well, they run public consultations on their draft guidelines, asking for feedback. They held specific stakeholder events, like on those consent or pay models we discussed.
So trying to get input before finalizing things.
Exactly. And they do an annual stakeholder survey, too, asking how clear and useful their guidance is. Apparently, they use that feedback to improve things like adding executive summaries or more visuals to their documents.
That sounds genuinely helpful, trying to make complex rules more accessible.
It seems so. And speaking of helpful, this is probably a good moment to thank our sponsors again. For navigating these compliance challenges, check out gdpriso.com. For cybersecurity and NIST resources, there's cmmcnist.tools. And for that broad compliance knowledge base, baseline.compliancehub.wiki is the place to go.
Great resources indeed. So they're engaging stakeholders, issuing guidance, coordinating enforcement. What about their global role? You mentioned that as part of the strategy.
Right. The report touches on their growing activity internationally. They participate in global privacy forums, and the chair, Anu Talis, has been involved in various international engagements.
What's the goal there?
The main aim seems to be promoting high data protection standards, similar to the GDPR, around the world, and also collaborating with other regions on shared challenges, because data flows don't stop at borders, do they?
They certainly don't.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we were to wrap this all up, what are the main takeaways for our listeners from this 2024 EDPB report? What should they really remember?
I'd say three main things stand out. First, a clear, continued push for consistent and effective GDPR application everywhere in Europe. No backing down there.
Right. Strong enforcement continues.
Second, the EDPB is actively getting to grips with the big challenges, especially new technology like AI, but also the interplay with new laws like the Digital Markets Act. They're trying to stay ahead of the curve or at least keep pace.
Adapting to the changing landscape.
Exactly. And third, the increasing focus on international cooperation, recognizing that data protection is now a truly global issue. So overall, the message is that data protection principles need to be deeply embedded in how organizations operate. It's not an optional extra.
That really sums it up well. It highlights just how vital the EDPB's work is in, protecting our fundamental right to data protection in this digital world that keeps changing so fast.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, let's give one final thank you to our sponsors who help make this discussion possible. gdprizo.com, cmms.tools, and baseline.compliancehub.wiki. This has been a really insightful look at where things stand.
Yes, I hope listeners found this deep dive into the EDPB's 2024 report useful for understanding the currents shaping data protection in Europe right now.
Absolutely. And maybe it leaves us all with a final thought to chew on. As you go about your day, think about how these principles and enforcement actions we've talked about really reflect that constant tension, that balancing act between driving innovation forward and protecting our fundamental right to privacy. Where do you see that playing out?
A great question to ponder.
Indeed. For more details, definitely check out the EDPB website itself. There's a wealth of information there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.